The Galactic Medical Academy had seen countless species, each with their own delicate, precise, and highly advanced healing techniques. Then humans arrived. Their idea of medicine involved slicing open bodies, shocking failing hearts, and, horror of horrors, physically touching patients. I was the first human admitted, and within a week, I had alien doctors fainting, security alarms blaring, and an ethics tribunal questioning whether my existence was a crime against medical science. But when a high-ranking diplomat lay dying, guess who they called? The Galactic Medical Academy stood as the pinnacle of interstellar healthcare, a shining beacon of knowledge where the brightest minds from countless species gathered to advance the art of healing. Its halls were lined with shimmering data panels displaying medical breakthroughs, its laboratories filled with cutting-edge technology that could regenerate lost limbs, purge diseases at the molecular level, and even reconstruct entire organs with nanite precision. It was a place of precision, order, and immaculate sterility. And then there was me. I arrived at the academy with all the enthusiasm of a fresh recruit ready to take on the galaxy. Humanity had only recently been accepted into the wider interstellar community, and we had a lot to prove. While we weren't the most advanced species, we were determined, adaptable, and had centuries of medical expertise built on one foundational principle: survival at all costs. My acceptance into the academy had been met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as an opportunity to expand their knowledge, to learn about the strange and often shocking resilience of human biology. Others, most, if I were being honest, viewed my presence with outright suspicion. As I stepped through the academy's entrance, I could feel the weight of 100 eyes on me. The halls were filled with beings of all shapes and sizes, some floating, some slithering, others perched on multiple limbs. But their gazes were unified in one common reaction: unease. I'd read about xenomedicine before arriving. I understood that most alien species had a vastly different approach to healthcare. They relied on gentle, non-invasive procedures. Their healing was guided by carefully calibrated energy fields, symbiotic organisms that repaired tissues, and advanced biotechnological implants that made disease almost irrelevant. Many of them viewed direct physical intervention, especially surgery, as something crude, primitive, even barbaric. I, on the other hand, had been trained in the messy, hands-on chaos of human emergency medicine. I had seen what blunt force trauma, gunshot wounds, and catastrophic organ failure could do to a body. I knew what it was like to have seconds to save a life, to make split-second decisions with blood on my hands. I wasn't afraid of getting my hands dirty. That was going to be a problem. The first sign of trouble came when I met my assigned mentor, a Veruli named Professor Exaltor. Veruli were an elegant species, their elongated forms covered in delicate bioluminescent patterns that pulsed gently in time with their thoughts. Professor Exaltor regarded me with all four of their golden eyes, their tendrils curling slightly in what I could only assume was discomfort. "You are the human," they said after a long pause, as if tasting the word. I nodded, "Yes, sir." Zaltor hesitated, then gestured for me to follow. I noticed that as we walked, other students whispered in hushed tones. Some gave me wary glances before looking away, their skin pigmentation shifting in what I assumed was a display of stress. I kept my head high. I was here to learn and to share what humanity had to offer. If they were afraid of human medicine, it was my job to show them its value. The lecture hall was packed when we arrived, filled with students from dozens of species. The topic of the day was trauma response, a subject I knew well. I settled into my seat, eager to compare notes with alien methodologies. Professor Exaltor began by explaining the standard intergalactic approach. It was fascinating. Their methods relied on stabilizing fields that suspended biological functions, allowing the body to heal naturally. Some species had neural regeneration pods that could restore cognitive function after severe injury. Others used organic nanites that could rebuild tissue from the inside out. Everything was precise, controlled, elegant. Then they brought up the first simulation. A holographic projection appeared, a being with simulated blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. The students murmured as they analyzed the case. Most recommended immediate stasis, followed by cellular reconstruction. Some suggested using biochemical enhancers to accelerate the healing process. And then it was my turn. I examined the simulation carefully. The patient's vitals were dropping fast. If this had been a real emergency back on Earth, there would be no time for careful stasis fields or molecular realignment. The only viable option was immediate physical intervention. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I reached for a scalpel. The reaction was instant. A wave of gasps filled the lecture hall. Bioluminescent patterns across various species flickered in distress. A reptilian student clamped their jaws shut in visible alarm. I could hear the nervous fluttering of insectoid wings from the back of the room. Even Professor Exaltor took an involuntary step backward. I hesitated, confused. Had I done something wrong? The patient was critical. Why was everyone acting like I had just pulled out a medieval torture device? Still, I pressed on. I made a clean incision exposing the simulated internal organs. I could practically feel the collective horror in the room as I used clamps to control the bleeding. The murmurs turned into full-on panic when I reached inside the projection, manually adjusting the damaged tissue before applying sutures. When I finished, the simulation beeped. Successful intervention. I looked up expecting some form of acknowledgement. Instead, I was met with stunned silence. Professor Zeltor twitched slightly, their tendrils coiling in visible discomfort. One of the students had fainted. Another was pressing themselves against the wall as if I might suddenly attack them. Then the alarms blared. I barely had time to process what was happening before two security drones entered the room, their mechanical arms unfolding with ominous efficiency. I frowned. Had I just been reported for practicing medicine? The Academy's security drones hovered ominously at the front of the lecture hall, their sleek metallic limbs unfolding as if prepared to detain a violent criminal. The room was still frozen in stunned silence, the only sound, the faint hum of their hovering propulsion systems. I remained standing next to the now stable simulation, confused but calm. I had just performed a routine emergency procedure, efficient, effective, and entirely successful. So why did everyone look like I had just committed an atrocity? Professor Zaltor remained rigid, their bioluminescent patterns flickering erratically. A clear sign of distress, though whether it was over my actions or the fact that the security team had just arrived, I wasn't sure. Several students had retreated to the back of the room, whispering in hushed tones, their various appendages quivering. One of the drones projected a monotone voice through the hall speakers. Medical ethics review initiated. Unauthorized invasive procedure detected. Awaiting judgment. I blinked. Judgment. Professor Zeltor cleared their throat, or at least made a sound that I assumed was the Veruli equivalent. The human was participating in the exercise, they said, though there was an unmistakable hesitation in their voice. They employed their species' standard medical techniques. A pause. The drone's visual sensors focused on me, scanning my ID badge. Human medical methodologies logged. Warning, level 5 bio-intervention detected. Review pending. The drones finally powered down their threat posture and hovered back toward the hall's exit, but the message was clear. I wasn't in trouble, yet, but my methods were now under scrutiny. Zaltor turned their gaze back to me, their eye stalks shifting slightly as if struggling to process what had just happened. Human, they said carefully, you physically entered the patient's body cavity. Yes, I said, unsure of why this was such an issue. That's how we fix internal bleeding. Another murmur spread through the class. The Veruli inhaled deeply, their skin pulsing with a strange, almost horrified glow. And the patient? They were awake during this procedure? I tilted my head, trying to figure out where this was going. If possible, we sedate them. If not, we use local anesthesia. If neither option is available, well, we work fast. A high-pitched clicking noise erupted from one of the insectoid students, their wings vibrating violently. Fast! They repeated, as though the concept itself was offensive. You do this while they are conscious? I sighed, rubbing my temples. Only if absolutely necessary. Judging by the reaction, that was the wrong thing to say. A reptilian student curled their tail protectively around themselves. A gelatinous life form in the back of the room visibly lost structural cohesion for a moment before reforming with an anxious wobble. The general consensus, it seemed, was that I was some sort of deranged, knife-wielding lunatic. Professor Zaltor shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that allowing me to demonstrate my techniques had been a mistake. Perhaps, they said, it would be wise for you to observe rather than participate in the next session. I recognized a diplomatic dismissal when I heard one. The next lesson focused on cardiac failure scenarios. Unlike trauma injuries, where alien medicine emphasized non-invasive tissue regeneration, their approach to heart failure was even more cautious. Most species had built-in redundancies, secondary hearts, distributed vascular networks, or complete neural backups. The idea of a single critical failure leading to instant death was terrifying to them. The first simulation depicted a being going into cardiac arrest. Immediately, the students sprang into action, activating stabilization fields, injecting biochemical stimulants, and preparing full-body regeneration protocols. Everything was handled with clinical precision. But the patient flatlined. The alien students hesitated, their hands twitching toward their consoles. Their training dictated that once brain function ceased, the patient was beyond saving. Even their most advanced technology couldn't reverse total neural death. I didn't hesitate. I ran forward, dropping to my knees beside the simulation. Without thinking, I positioned my hands and slammed them against the chest. The entire room screamed. Bioluminescent patterns flared wildly. One student outright collapsed. I could hear wings buzzing frantically, a panicked, chittering noise echoing through the hall. Professor Exaltor made a choking sound. I ignored them. I pressed again and again. Each compression forced oxygen through the simulated circulatory system. I tilted the head back, checked the airway, and, seeing no response, leaned down to deliver a breath. The human is patiently patient, someone shrieked. A flurry of movement erupted around me. Zaltor staggered forward, reaching out but too horrified to intervene. My hands continued their rhythmic compressions, working against time itself, fighting against a death sentence that these aliens had accepted too easily. Then the monitor beeped. The simulated heart resumed beating, the vitals stabilized, the patient lived. Silence. I sat back, catching my breath. Around me, the lecture hall remained in stunned disbelief. The students looked at the monitor, then at me, then back again, as though unable to process what had just happened. Professor Zaltor's skin had taken on a deep, unsettled hue. That is not how we treat cardiac failure. Well, I said, stretching my arms, you do now. A fainting sound echoed in the background. I had the distinct impression that my time at the academy was going to be interesting. I sat in the dean's office, staring at the massive, translucent amphibioid who was now responsible for deciding whether I was a medical genius or an unhinged butcher. The dean's semi-gelatinous body pulsed with shifting colors, an indicator of deep contemplation or possibly stress. The walls of the office shimmered with holographic reports, all likely filled with accounts of my supposed crimes against intergalactic medical ethics. The silence stretched. Finally, the dean exhaled, a strange bubbling sound emanating from their throat. We understand, they said slowly, their voice a careful attempt at neutrality, that humans have unique perspectives on medicine. I nodded, hoping this was leading toward something productive. We do what works. The dean's colors flickered erratically. Yes, that is precisely the concern. I glanced at one of the reports on their desk. It was a medical ethics violation form, already half filled out. My name, my species, and under the section labeled offense, a single sentence. Blunt force resuscitation and unauthorized. I sighed internally. Dean, with all due respect, I didn't do anything wrong. The simulation patient was dying. I did what was necessary. The dean's gaze fixated on me. You physically attacked a non-responsive... I frowned. That's called CPR. A long pause. The dean's fingers drummed against their desk, the webbed digits making a faint slapping noise. Your methods are... aggressive. I shrugged. They're effective. The dean's skin flushed a deep shade of blue, a sign of either resignation or impending dread. The Academy prides itself on gentle and controlled medical intervention, they said, as if reciting a sacred law. We utilize precision technology and regenerative sciences to facilitate healing. Your techniques? They trailed off, as if struggling to find a word that wouldn't cause offense. I decided to help save lives. Cause distress, the dean corrected sharply. Professor Zeltor's report indicates that multiple students required psychological counseling after witnessing your demonstration. I resisted the urge to groan. It was chest compressions. To force a non-functional circulatory system into motion, the dean countered, looking genuinely disturbed. You understand how barbaric that appears to other species? I leaned forward. Do you understand that it works? Another silence. The dean's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time I saw something other than alarm in their expression. Curiosity, hesitation, perhaps even reluctant acknowledgement. But they weren't ready to concede. Not yet. Human, they said carefully. Perhaps it would be beneficial for you to observe for a time before continuing direct participation. I knew what that meant. Stay out of trouble. Stop traumatizing the other students. I forced a polite smile. Of course, Dean. Their skin shifted to a more neutral color. Good. I trust you will take this opportunity to learn our methodologies. I nodded, but in my head I was already thinking, or you'll learn mine. I left the office and returned to my dormitory, where I found a notice on my datapad. Mandatory ethics review session, attendance required. Great, a lecture on how not to save lives. The next day I sat in a small, sterile conference room with several instructors and a holographic projection of what I assumed was the Academy's official ethics board. The beings before me represented a wide range of species, some with gelatinous bodies, others with exoskeletons, and a few with features so alien that I wasn't entirely sure where to look when addressing them. A hologram of my crimes was projected above the table. Slow map footage of me performing CPR. A magnified clip of my hands making an incision during the trauma exercise. The moment I reached for a bone saw in a past session, that one got a particularly loud murmur of horror. A multi-limbed arboreal being who seemed to be leading the discussion finally spoke. Human, they said, their voice a careful balance of diplomacy and dread. Do you understand why your methods have alarmed the Academy? I exhaled slowly because you're not used to them. The room went silent. The arboreal being's limbs twitched. That is an understatement. I leaned forward. Your medicine is based on perfection. Mine is based on survival. You see invasive procedures as damage. We see them as necessary intervention. You wait for the body to heal itself. We force it to heal if we have to. That's the difference. Several members of the ethics board shifted uncomfortably. A reptilian with iridescent scales flicked their tail in clear disapproval. The difference is that your methods resemble violence. I fought back a frustrated sigh. Do you know how many humans have been brought back from the brink of death because of CPR? How many lives we save by being willing to act instead of waiting for a machine to do it for us? The arboreal instructor folded their limbs. And do you know how many of our species would die from shock alone if subjected to such treatment? I paused. I hadn't considered that. Some species might not just be frightened by human medicine. They might actually die from fear. The room remained tense, the instructors watching me closely. The arboreal figure finally spoke again. For now, you are permitted to remain in the program. However, you will strictly observe, unless given explicit permission to act. Do you understand? I clenched my jaw but nodded. The session ended, and I walked out feeling conflicted. I understood their perspective, but I also knew they were wrong. Medicine wasn't about what was comfortable, it was about saving lives. They could force me to observe, but sooner or later an emergency would happen, one they couldn't solve with their delicate, non-invasive techniques. And when that moment came, they'd have no choice but to call on the one person they had been trying to silence. Observation duty was the academic equivalent of being benched. While other students were allowed to participate in advanced procedures, conducting cellular realignment therapies, testing nanite-assisted organ regeneration, and using bioelectric resonance to stabilize patients, I was forced to sit back and watch. Every day I attended lectures, clinical demonstrations, and simulated emergency drills without lifting a finger. It was infuriating. The worst part? The more I observed, the more I saw the flaws in their approach. For all their sophistication, alien medicine had a fatal weakness. It was built on the assumption that every emergency could be controlled. Their methods were slow, delicate, precise, designed for treating conditions in sterile, well-monitored environments. But what about real emergencies? The battlefield, a ship decompressing in deep space, a disaster where there was no time for careful interventions? I saw patients in simulated scenarios die because no one was willing to act aggressively. I watched as critical patients were put into stasis fields that only slowed their deaths instead of stopping them. I saw a student hesitate when an arterial rupture occurred in a test subject, their hands trembling as they waited for the biogel to gradually seal the wound, when a single clamp could have stopped the bleeding in seconds. I gritted my teeth. This wasn't medicine, it was hesitation dressed as compassion. Still, I followed the rules. I stayed silent until the day everything changed. The Academy was hosting a diplomatic summit, bringing in representatives from over a dozen species to showcase the advancements in intergalactic medicine. It was a grand event filled with live demonstrations, expert panels, and discussions on future medical collaboration. The halls bustled with activity, dignitaries floating, walking, or slithering between exhibits. I, of course, had been assigned to a corner meant to be silent and out of sight. Then the commotion started. It happened near the central atrium. A high-ranking Avaxi diplomat suddenly collapsed mid-speech, their segmented body convulsing violently. Gasps filled the hall as their aides rushed to their side, their frilled head crests flaring in panic. Within seconds, Academy doctors swarmed the scene, activating medical scanners and stabilizing fields. A shimmering suspension field wrapped around the diplomat, slowing their vitals, their body held in a perfect stasis. I pushed forward to get a better look. Even from a distance, I could see the problem, a major cardiac event. The doctors spoke in urgent, hushed tones, running diagnostics, debating the best course of action. Someone suggested a neural interface assessment. Another recommended an enzyme therapy. No one was doing anything. The Avaxi's vital signs were dropping. Even in stasis, the biological damage continued. Their species had a unique vascular system. Once a cardiac event started, clots formed rapidly. If they didn't act immediately, there wouldn't be a heart left to save. I stepped forward instinctively, but a security drone hovered in front of me, blocking my path. Observe, don't intervene. I clenched my fists. My training screamed at me. I could see the solution, the exact steps needed: a direct cardiac massage to restart circulation, immediate clot removal, force the heart back into rhythm, now. Or lose the patient forever. But no one moved. I looked at the lead Academy physician, a tall, wispy being with translucent skin. Their elongated fingers hovered over a control panel, adjusting biochemical levels with excruciating patience. Their species lived for centuries. They had no concept of urgency. I glanced at the vitals, too slow. The diplomat had seconds left. Something in me snapped. I shoved past the security drone, dropping to my knees beside the diplomat before anyone could react. The moment my hands made contact, a chorus of horrified screams erupted around me. I ignored them. I positioned my hands and delivered a sharp compression to the diplomat's thorax. The surrounding physicians recoiled as if I had detonated an explosive. Their delicate medical instruments were useless now. Their stabilizing fields couldn't force life back into a failing heart. But I could. I worked quickly. Compressions, controlled breaths, forcing circulation, keeping oxygen moving. The diplomat's aides screeched in protest, one of them nearly lunging at me before a security drone held them back. The lead physician's voice was shaking. What are you... Stop that! Here! I tuned them out, focused on the vitals, still declining. Time for something more drastic. I reached into the emergency kit on my belt, one they had explicitly told me not to use, and pulled out a compact defibrillator, a primitive, barbaric device by their standards, but one that worked. I pressed the pads to the Avaxi's chest, set the charge. Then, in full view of the horrified diplomatic delegation, I shocked one of the most important political figures in the galaxy. The diplomat's body jerked violently. Their aides wailed in panic. The assembled physicians looked as though I had just assassinated them instead of saving their life. Then the monitor beeped. A single rhythmic pulse. Another. The diplomat's breathing stabilized, their body stopped convulsing, their crest, once flared in distress, settled back into a neutral position, the vital signs steadied. The crowd was silent. I exhaled, sitting back on my heels, sweat beading on my forehead. I could still feel the weight of every shocked gaze on me. The lead physician was pale, their translucent skin almost ghostly. You just... I pushed myself up and dusted off my uniform. Saved a life, I finished for them. A security drone buzzed closer, clearly waiting for an order. The lead physician swallowed hard. It was take him to the ethics board. I sighed. Again, the walk to the ethics board felt different this time. The corridors of the academy, once welcoming, now seemed colder, their polished floors reflecting my every step like an endless corridor of judgment. The flashing lights of the security drones hovered near me, their silent presence reminding me of their growing unease. I could sense it. They were watching me more closely now, the tension in the air thick with the anticipation of what would happen next. I could feel the weight of the last few hours pressing against me. Saving the diplomat had been necessary, but the reaction had been just as intense as I expected. The Academy's carefully crafted image of medical precision had been shattered in front of their highest-ranking dignitaries, and I, the reckless human, was now at the center of it. There was no doubt that the ethics board would be looking for an example to make of me. A cautionary tale for anyone else who might even consider going outside the lines of accepted practice. When I reached the boardroom, the doors opened automatically, revealing the full council of the Academy's highest medical authorities. They were sitting in a semicircle, their various forms eerily silent and still as they awaited my arrival. The same figures I had seen before, gelatinous insectoid and bioluminescent beings, all stared at me, their multifaceted eyes narrowed with suspicion. In the center of the room, a towering holographic display projected the scene from earlier, showing my actions in full, horrifying detail. The diplomat convulsing, the shock, the gasps of the witnesses, my uninvited intervention. The silence hit like a physical wall. The air was so thick with judgment I could almost taste it. I stood there, feeling my pulse racing, my breath shallow despite my best attempts to remain calm. The board chair, a towering insectoid being whose carapace shimmered with an iridescent glow, was the first to speak. "Human," they began, their voice deep and measured, "you stand before this council accused of violating the core tenets of medical intervention. You have, time and again, disregarded the most fundamental rule of the Academy. No action can be taken that risks greater harm to the patient." I stood still, arms crossed, trying to steady my breathing. The Avaxi diplomat's image hung in front of me, their bodies still recovering from the cardiac arrest, a reminder of the choice I had made. "I saved their life," I said, quietly but firmly. My voice felt like a small rebellion in a room that demanded compliance. By exposing them to additional trauma, the chair retorted, their many legs shifting as their body gave off a low hum. That shock, they hissed, their tone betraying a hint of fury. That shock was not only unnecessary, it was barbaric. You subjected the patient to a level of violence not seen in modern medicine. Then why was their heart still stopping? I shot back. You were too busy following protocols and waiting for the machines to catch up. In the meantime, they were dying. Every second you delayed, the chance of saving them dropped. A sharp collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Even the chairs seemed taken aback, their segmented antennae flicking in confusion. But they were quick to recover, their voice cold and precise. You, human, have proven that your methods may work in the short term, but the greater danger is the precedent you set. The implications of your actions could have disastrous consequences for interspecies medical standards. It is not just about one patient. It is about the integrity of all patients in the galaxy. I could feel the eyes of the others on me, the weight of their disapproval seeping into every fiber of my being, but I wasn't about to back down. I get it, I said, trying to control my rising frustration. You're all afraid of the chaos my methods might create. But you're losing sight of the point. What if there's no time to be gentle? What if waiting for all your fancy tools is just wasting a life that's slipping away? You think your perfect protocols are going to save a species from instant death? They won't. Sometimes you just have to do what's necessary, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. The room was still. The board members exchanged quiet, rapid whispers among themselves, their multiple eyes darting between me and the holographic image of the diplomat's recovery. I could tell they were trying to reconcile the clinical data with their deeply ingrained beliefs about medical ethics. But they had no answer for the glaring fact in front of them. My methods had worked. The silence stretched on until the chair spoke again, their voice less certain. We are aware, human, that your species possesses a unique approach to emergency medicine. However, we cannot ignore the fact that this approach is not without its risks. There is far too much at stake for us to allow such methods to be employed without thorough review. I swallowed hard, but I wasn't backing down. So, what's next? Am I getting expelled for saving a life? You want me to just sit back and let people die because I'm not following the proper protocols? The chair's antennae twitched, and for the first time I saw something akin to doubt in their eyes. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by their usual veneer of professionalism. This council will decide your fate, human. Your methods will be under review. In the meantime, you are to cease participation in any further demonstrations or patient interventions. The weight of the decision hung over me like a shadow. Expulsion, suspension, more lectures, more waiting. I could feel the dread building, but I wouldn't let them break me. Not yet. I stood straighter. I'll wait, but you won't keep me from helping. When the time comes, you'll see that my methods aren't the problem. You're too afraid to do what's necessary. The council's gaze didn't soften, but I saw something else flicker behind their eyes. A realization that they couldn't easily dismiss me. And that, in itself, was a victory. For now, I would follow their rules. But there would come a time when the galaxy needed someone willing to act. And when that moment arrived, they would remember who was ready to step in when no one else would. The weeks that followed my hearing felt like a slow, suffocating crawl. I was confined to the back corners of the academy, an observer, a pariah. The more I sat through endless lectures on perfecting medical techniques and controlled emergency protocols, the more it became clear that the academy had lost sight of what medicine was really about, saving lives, regardless of the method. Their sterile, clinical approach had its place, but the galaxy was far from being a sterile place. I spent hours poring over data from past missions, reading about disastrous events where waiting for the perfect solution had resulted in unnecessary loss of life, crashed ships, rebel skirmishes, and disease outbreaks in low-source colonies. Each of these scenarios had one thing in common: hesitation. There was no room for hesitation when lives were at stake. But they refused to see that. They refused to acknowledge that there were situations where aggression and speed were the only solutions. One afternoon, as I sat in the student commons scrolling through medical reports, a message pinged across my terminal. It was a notification about an upcoming field exercise. I'd been excused from the last few, but the message now said my participation was required. The Academy was sending a team to simulate a mass casualty scenario in a non-inhabited zone, an area that had been deemed too dangerous for most species to operate in, but one that the Academy's protocols had deemed safe enough for educational purposes. It was to be a mock disaster response, a demonstration of how to handle multiple injuries in a hostile environment. It sounded like the perfect opportunity to show them what they were missing. The simulation site was on an asteroid station, abandoned for centuries, but still equipped with all the necessary infrastructure to replicate a full-scale emergency. The Academy had set up a network of trauma bays, and the students were divided into teams that would have to treat a variety of injuries in real time. It wasn't going to be easy. These simulations were designed to test every decision, every method, and every possible outcome. A wrong move meant a lower grade. A delayed response meant failure. The moment we arrived, I could already feel the unease in the air. The other students moved with a sort of precision and hesitance, already trying to mentally map out every move, every choice. They were thinking like machines, calculating risks and outcomes, as if every person they encountered could be quantified and healed with the right tool at the right time. Their minds were racing through all the technical options, but no one seemed prepared for the chaos that was about to unfold. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop my mind from running through the worst-case scenarios. What if we lost power in the middle of the operation? What if the medical drones malfunctioned? What if there were too many injuries to keep track of at once? I didn't want to just be prepared for the protocol, I wanted to be prepared for the unexpected. But I wasn't about to make my thoughts public. We were led into the command center, where the instructors briefed us. As they went through the scenario, the potential disasters, the chaos that would soon unfold, I couldn't help but notice their eyes. Focused, determined, but also distant. They didn't truly understand what they were preparing for. In their world, simulations were safe. In mine, they were practice for the real thing. When the drill started, the first wave of injured students was rolled in. They were acting their parts, bleeding from fake wounds, screaming for help, their bodies in various states of shock. Some had lost limbs, others were suffering from respiratory failure. But the one thing all these victims had in common was that they weren't real, and that made all the difference. As the others scrambled to follow the protocol, assessing injuries one by one, calculating the severity of the damage, I jumped into action. The first patient I reached was a student who had sustained critical blood loss from an artificial wound to their arm. They were starting to fade, their vitals dropping by the second. The others, busy with their own patients, didn't even notice. They were too busy checking their scanners and making sure the stabilizing devices were in place. I didn't hesitate. I ripped open the first aid kit and applied a pressure bandage, but I could already see the bleeding wouldn't stop unless I acted faster. I grabbed the closest tourniquet, a simple one that wasn't part of the simulation. The others were watching me now. I could see their disbelief, their hesitation. They weren't sure if I was following the right steps, if I was violating some sacred rule. I didn't care. I slapped the tourniquet around the patient's arm, tightened it, and moved on to the next. I heard murmurs behind me, the instructors whispering to each other as they observed my actions. Some seemed surprised, others horrified. They hadn't anticipated this level of urgency from me. They hadn't anticipated someone willing to force a solution rather than wait for the machines to catch up. The next casualty was suffering from a collapsed lung. Their breathing was shallow, and they were in severe pain. The others were focused on adjusting the mechanical support systems, trying to administer pain relief, and slowly stabilizing their breathing. I didn't have the time. I grabbed a needle and immediately inserted a chest tube, creating an air vent. They gasped, their breathing returned to normal, and within moments, they were stable. The instructor overseeing that station had approached me, clearly alarmed by my swift, aggressive approach. But when they saw the results, their expression faltered. They said nothing, but their look was enough. They couldn't deny that my methods had worked. The patients were alive. They were stable. They had been saved. By the time the simulation ended, I had worked on 5 different patients, each time choosing speed and direct action over the calm precision the others adhered to. When the simulation was over, the instructors gathered the group together for the debriefing, their faces unreadable. But when it was my turn, the head instructor's voice held a trace of respect. "You've proved a point, human," they said, their tone now less dismissive. But there's more to medicine than saving lives. It's about managing the system, balancing the immediate response with the long-term health of the patient." I nodded. "And sometimes the balance comes from survival first." The room was quiet, but I could feel something shifting. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time, I saw the glimmer of acknowledgement in their eyes. They weren't ready to embrace the full spectrum of human medical methods, but the seed had been planted. The day after the simulation was a blur of half-hearted lectures and strained glances. I could feel the weight of every instructor's gaze on me, the growing awareness that I had disrupted something far bigger than just a field exercise. The academy had prided itself on its controlled environment where every variable was measured, every response calibrated. And then I had come along and thrown that all into chaos. It wasn't until later that day, when I received an encrypted message from the head of the ethics board, that I understood the full extent of the ripple effect my actions had caused. The message was brief but clear. A meeting had been called, and I was to attend. The moment I stepped into the boardroom, the atmosphere was different. There was no anger, no veiled judgment in the air. Instead, the room was tense, but there was an underlying hum of something else, an openness. The board members were quiet, their usual demeanor of cold professionalism replaced with something approaching curiosity. Even the chair, once so steadfast in their disapproval, seemed to regard me with a new kind of wariness. The holographic projector flickered to life, displaying footage from the simulation, but this time, it was not my actions that dominated the screen. The camera was focused on the reactions of the other students, the hesitations, the second-guessing, the times when they waited for the machines or the systems to intervene rather than making a bold decision themselves. There was silence as the video played, and I could see the discomfort on the faces of the council members as they watched their most trusted methods play out in real time, failing to save lives. Finally, the chair spoke. "Your actions in the simulation, human, have forced us to reconsider our approach to emergency intervention." The words sent a shiver down my spine. For the first time since I'd entered the academy, the room felt like it was shifting, like the structure of the institution itself was being reevaluated. They hadn't just been observing me, they'd been evaluating the system, and they had found it wanting. "You demonstrated a style of medicine we had dismissed as too reckless," the chair continued, their voice measured but still tinged with uncertainty. "You acted without regard for protocol, without hesitation or second thoughts. The results were unconventional, but ultimately, the patients you treated survived." I remained quiet, but I could feel the weight of their words settling over me. They weren't condemning me. They were acknowledging something far more important. They had underestimated the value of speed, of decisive action in life or meth scenarios. "But you must understand," another council member, a fluid-like being with translucent skin, spoke up, "that your methods go against everything we have worked to establish in this academy. Medicine is about precision. It's about minimizing risk. You cannot simply act based on instinct or brute force." I had been expecting this. The tension between their old ways and what I represented, human medicine, had come to a head. They still couldn't see the full picture, but they were starting to understand that their precision had its limits. "I'm not asking you to throw everything away," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "But the reality is, sometimes you can't afford to be precise. Sometimes you need to just act." That's what you saw in that simulation. The hesitation, the waiting. By the time they'd processed all their options, those patients were closer to death. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't worrying about the long-term consequences. I was making sure they lived long enough to have a future. And in a real emergency, that's what matters. The room was still, the members considering my words. I could see the struggle on their faces, the internal conflict. They were used to treating the patient as an isolated system, something to be studied, fixed, and protected. But they hadn't yet learned to treat the situation, the chaos, the unpredictability, the reality of life-threatening events. And that was where human medicine excelled. "We're not asking you to abandon your methods," the chair said after a long pause, "but we do need to understand them better. We need to integrate some of your unorthodox approaches into our curricula." It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't an endorsement, not yet. They were still holding on to their control, to their precious protocols, but they were finally beginning to recognize the value in risky decisions. The kinds of decisions we had been taught to make back home. The kind that relied on instinct and the courage to act when the world around you was falling apart. "Oh, what now?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Am I going to get a lecture on ethics or have my license revoked?" The chair's expression softened just slightly. "No. Instead, we've decided to create a new program. One that combines the best of your methods with the structure we already have in place. You will be a mentor in this new initiative, training future medical officers on how to handle high-risk situations with an open mind and a willingness to improvise." I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a full victory, not yet, but it was the first step. They were starting to see the cracks in their perfect system. They were starting to see the necessity of breaking their own rules when the lives of others were on the line. "Don't think this is a free pass, human," the chair added, their voice tinged with humor. "You'll be watched very carefully, but for now, consider this an opportunity." I nodded, keeping my composure. I wasn't here to prove them wrong. I was here to teach them, to help them understand that there was no one-size-fits-all solution in medicine, not when people were dying. And if they were willing to learn, then maybe, just maybe, I could help them save more lives. I left the room with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't over. There was still a long way to go, but in that moment, I knew that something had shifted. And no matter how hard they tried to resist, they couldn't unsee what I had shown them. Human medicine wasn't a side approach, it was a necessary one. As the Academy reeled trying to digest the raw, unfiltered power of human medicine, one thing was certain: the galaxy would never look at us the same way again. In a universe where precision, protocols, and safety were king, I proved that sometimes, to survive, you need to throw the rules out the airlock. Medicine isn't about avoiding risk. It's about having the guts to make the choice when everything's on the line. And as the stars watch on, waiting for their next emergency, just remember, if it ever comes down to life or death, don't hesitate. Humanity will always be ready to step up. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more out of this world stories that'll keep you questioning the real limits of survival.